Hi, everyone. This is Alan Schimmel, and welcome to another DevOps.com broadcast or webinar here. And I think we have a great webinar here for you. I am just double checking as we've had a little bit of technical difficulties here at the last moment. I apologize. I want to make sure everyone can see our screen. And I'm just going to ask Carson, can you see the screen?
We can see the screen.
Okay, I unfortunately don't see the screen, so I'm going to apologize. I'm going to have to go with what I have on my slides. All right, so guys, many of you have sat in on our presentations before, and you know kind of the drill, but let me go over real quickly. We use the GoToWebinar system, and that allows us to really do a good job with questions and making this interactive with our audience. If you look at your GoToWebinar control panel, which for many of you will be in the top right-hand corner, you will see a section marked questions. And I see someone already wrote hi everyone in there. But we've set aside some time for questions today, and we're going to ask you if you'd be so kind. As questions pop into your mind, you got something you want to say, you want to ask our great panel, pop your question in there. Don't wait till the end of today's webinar to ask the question. Please, do so right away. And this way it's queued. We'll have a record of it. We'll try to get everyone. Generally, it's not for the hello worlds, but if you do have a question, put it in there. If you are having audio difficulties or video difficulties like I am, not seeing the slides, we do have people monitoring the chat window, which would be the bottom section on your GoToWebinar control panel. And you can put your chat in there, and we will try our best to try to help you with it. So with that being said, though, let us get moving. Today's webinar is a little different than our normal webinar in that it is a DevOps.com webinar, and it's based, it's actually a combination of DevOps.com, Security Boulevard, and Container Journal. So it hits all of the media ops property, and it's based upon an editorial calendar focus for us, which is container security. We reached out to some of the leading lights in the container security market and world, and I'm really, really pleased to tell you we've got three real container security experts. All three of these gentlemen have really been through the container security, evolution up to this point, almost from the beginning, and have a lot to say about it. You're going to notice that all three of them hold, co-founder or C-level types, VP types of positions at their companies. And I will tell you that you'll be hard-pressed to find three people who know the fact patterns behind container security more than these three guys. With that said, let me introduce you to them. Of course, as I mentioned, I'm Alan Schimmel, editor-in-chief. But first of all, joining us from Twistlock is John Morello. John's is the CTO at Twistlock and one of their, key people driving the product and understanding from their customers what the issues are around security. So John, welcome to today's webinar.
Thanks, Alan.
Great, sounds good. Joining John and myself, I'm happy to have a friend of mine. I don't know if he's in Israel today or the US or where in the world Ronnie is, but Ronnie Osnot, VP of Marketing and Product Security at Aqua, has really over the, and I know Ronnie now a few years, has really proven his chops in the container security market. He's probably one of the most well-grounded and most knowledgeable people that we have in container security. So Ronnie, pleasure to have you on board today. Just want to make sure you can hear.
I can hear very well. Thanks, Alan. And I am in Israel today.
Very good. Oh, so you're joining us in the evening. Thank you. And then last but certainly not least is a friend of mine from the security world. I don't know, Carson, has it been 10 years, 12 years, more than that maybe?
It's been a long time, Alan.
Yeah, we know what. Leave it at that. Carson Sweet, co-founder and CTO of Cloud Passage. Welcome, Carson.
And thanks for having me again.
All righty. So, guys, today's really arises out of an ebook that we did over here at DevOps.com around container security. And I think everyone who registered for this event will be receiving a copy of the ebook available for download. So if you want to pass it along to friends or let your peers know about it, there'll be a link at the end and in the notes where people can download this book. There's no charge, obviously, or anything. But it is based on that, and we welcome you to grab that book and take any learning you can from it. So with that said, guys, let's jump right in here. I put this in here. I don't think it's a aha for many of us. I don't think it's a big aha for many of the attendees. The container market is bonkers. The market passed the $1 billion mark. 2016 was, I think, 762 million. This is based on 451 research. I understand we might have some the market is scheduled, as you can see here, it's projected to grow to over 2.5 billion in just another 2 years, with a 40% annual growth rate in 2020. I will tell you, I will say, guys, am I being heard on this? No.
You are, but the audio is not very good, Alan.
I apologize. It looks like we're having internet issues here. It's going to be a problem. Guys, just keep me honest and let me know on it, and we will do our best to get around this. Is it better now or no?
Yeah, it's better now.
Yes, maybe. Okay. So, look, I don't have to be the end all be all judge on this, gentlemen. Anybody want to comment on where how big the container market is? Doesn't have to be by size of the market in billions, but percentage of organizations using containers and stuff like that. If anyone has any comments or metrics that they've seen you'd like to contribute to the conversation.
Well, and I can tell you from the Twistlock perspective, the growth in knowledge and awareness, and I think more importantly, active deployments of containers just over the past year has been pretty astounding. I mean, when we started Twistlock back in 2015, a lot of times we were having conversations just to frame with people what a container actually is. And, there was a fairly small number of people who were early adopters that were actually doing something in production with them. But by and large, it was a market that had yet really to develop. Whereas if you look at today, not only does pretty much everybody know what containers are, but we see people using them in really mission critical ways, far beyond the Ubers and Airbnb types of the world, but into like standard industries, manufacturing, healthcare, financial services. And I think when you get to the point where a technology is just looked at as like, well, yes, of course we would deploy this in containers. It would be silly not to, which is kind of the same way people would have thought about, cloud. I mean, nobody goes and purchases a bunch of physical servers today, at least very few people do. And I think containers are getting to that same mentality where that's the default posture for deploying and running apps, which is a great thing, I think, for all of us in this ecosystem and everybody on the webinar to understand that space and be ready to really capitalize on the advantages it brings.
Yep.
Yeah, I completely agree with John. This is Ronnie. I think there's two other things I would add. One is that unlike previous waves of new technologies in application data center related stuff, we see adoption happening in large enterprises in no less, not any lesser than small ones. And actually, the large enterprises often tend to lead the pack, which is interesting, and just kind of points to the overwhelming benefits of using containers. And the other aspect is that there is a difference between market penetration and market adoption. So if you look at where today within the enterprise market, global 2000 or even below that, containers are used, I would say that in the vast majority of enterprises, you have some level of usage of containers. But as John pointed out, what we're seeing, the big change we saw in 2017 is that a lot of these enterprises moved into production with at least one application, sometimes two, and sometimes hundreds. And that is the big difference. So the early adopters in this market are already deploying hundreds of applications in production, whether in the cloud or on-prem, while the early adopters have some applications in development, or some in planning, moving into deployment, but not really in production yet. But they're moving very fast as well. So it's a very kind of sticky technology where if it does penetrate an organization, it tends to spread very fast, and adoption tends to grow very quickly.
Yeah, and Alan, just to sort of add just a touch of additional perspective, from the cloud passage perspective, we're also seeing very, very fast adoption, particularly on the large enterprise side. One thing that we found interesting is as you start to move down from the large enterprise organizations to the mid-market, we're seeing a huge amount of interest in container as a service. A lot of our mid-market customers are really focused on what AWS is doing. We're hearing quite a lot about Fargate. We're hearing quite a lot about ECS solutions that we're working with AWS on currently. That, I think, is going to be a big factor that comes into play. And I think that in general, in addition to the container adoption itself, there are a lot of ancillary or neighboring technologies that we're also seeing a lot of adoption of. Kubernetes is probably a great example, flannel overlay networks. So in addition to just containers, the advice to the listeners would be look closely at the adjacencies, because the way that your containers are going to be used and the options you have available for security and compliance are going to be largely predicated on the things that are around containers, and in many cases are actually manage the containers, like a Mesos or a Kubernetes type of resource management platform. Do we still have Alan?
Appears that we may not. Ronnie, it'd be interesting maybe to hear from you on like what are some of the challenges that you guys hear from your customers, or maybe not challenges, but concerns that they have about containers and security, and how do they adapt their existing security and regulatory needs into this containerized environment? Like, what are some of the top things that you guys hear at Aqua?
So we see, well, first of all, thanks for taking over, John. We see, there's, if you look at containers, we lost the presentation as well now. If you look at containers and what they're actually changing in the enterprise, it's not just technology, right? It changes the stack, but it also changes the process of how applications are being developed and deployed. Hopefully people can still hear me.
I think so. It seems like there's a number of people still joined, so yes.
Okay.
Yes, I hear you. I just don't see you, but I hear you.
Yeah, we lost the screen. Yeah.
Yep.
There we're back. Yeah. So there is. It's both. It's both a change in the stack. You have that added layer of abstraction, but also the process is very different, because containers are at that nexus of DevOps processes as well as the technology itself. And then, of course, once you look at cloud native applications, you're talking about microservices architecture, which also changes networking. So you have these kind of three things, I would say, that roll up into all the focus areas as well as benefits that customers are looking for around automating the process to make sure that you can handle the speed at which these applications are deployed, ensuring that you have visibility and control over what's running, and controlling the network to prevent, attacks from spreading beyond, an isolated incident or any kind of lateral movement within the network. So we see all of these things, and it's a combination that really it can be daunting to some people, but most customers just follow a set of best practices. There is some bread and butter stuff you have to implement, and then you can tackle the more challenging issues.
Yep. So Ronnie, hopefully you can hear me now. I mean, the bottom line is look, containers are probably growing even faster than we saw with VMware and hypervisor adoption. But this has created a situation around container security, and that's what our presentation is about today. So let's move to the next slide, if we can. And the idea here was to give our audience some practical steps that organizations can take to reasonably secure their containerized ecosystems, some pro tips, some bust up some myths, and so forth. So we're going to start with some practical steps. And by the way, folks, these come right out of the ebook that's available. So, first practical steps really are these three right here, and we step them up. Access control, vulnerability management assessments, it sounds kind of elementary, and then monitoring your network traffic. Again, sounds elementary, but you know what? You do it for containers the same way you do it. You don't leave your security common sense at the door to the container. So, guys, what do you think about these practical steps?
Yeah, so I'll jump in very quickly, Alan. These are a great start for sure, and I don't think there's anything sort of shocking for security practitioners that are on the phone. These are pretty commonsensical things. One area that we see just a couple of points for consideration for the audience is access control. In many cases, can involve not just traditional access management with accounts and IP addresses and so forth, but there is a missing link in many cases. We see a lot of companies very early in container deployment using things like a single registry for everything. So they've got all their production, all of their non-production, all of their experimental container images in one place. This is very similar to what we saw in the early 90s when organizations started to build their own DNS services, and they sort of had one DNS for everything. Later, we saw this split brain approach. We're starting to see some of the larger enterprises, particularly as auditors are showing up and understand a little bit more about containers. We're starting to see a bit of that. So managing access control by actually compartmentalizing parts of the container pipeline. The other interesting thing that we're seeing is as folks are advancing with their practices, we're seeing a lot of organizations start to leverage the DevOps process that is often used to manage containers, particularly in very advanced continuous delivery shops, to actually make those developers and those container engineers force multipliers for security. So vulnerability assessment, access management, things like that are actually being instrumented inside that CDCI process, and the developers themselves are being given access to tools like the tool vendors that you have on the call today. So they themselves, the way that we phrase it is they can check their work before they turn it in and understand if a particular container configuration is going to pass the security checks that happen further down the pipeline. So that is, both an educational benefit for the security organization, and it creates force multipliers for them, which they're in dire need of.
Fair enough. Guys, let's move to the next slide if we can. So beyond those practical tips, we're starting to see, Carson, as you mentioned, the industry respond as an industry. And one of the things we saw was the CIS Docker benchmark, which again is in your ebooks. You'll be able to get a link to the actual benchmark itself. The folks at Docker contributed to this, as well as others. And here again are kind of 5 areas for container security that you need to focus in on. And as I say, if you want to use your questions section, you can start asking questions and we'll get to them with our panel. But these are the areas. If you're interested in container security, these are the kind of 5 areas you can jump right in on. And I'm not going to read them all out. You could read them hopefully yourselves. But securing host configuration, secure Docker daemon configuration, security in container images and build files, security container runtimes, and then of course your Docker security operations. And this is very Docker centric, but surveys show that something like 90% of all the containers running out there are in fact Docker containers. They may be using a Kubernetes or a Messio CoreOS, which uses Kubernetes, or some other container management orchestration type of solution or layer. But the containers themselves, it appears Docker, the open source for the most part, Docker containers, the container of choice. Just wondering from my 3 panelists, is that what you guys are seeing as well? In terms of Docker?
No doubt. Docker's winning. No question about it.
Well, I would say even more than just Docker winning. I think the whole stack. I mean, Docker is a big part of that, but the way that a lot of customers are thinking about the space now is, Docker is the runtime, of course, but there's a orchestration and management layer on top of that, which increasingly is Kubernetes or one of its derivatives like OpenShift or Tectonic or something like that. And for a lot of organizations, that is the primary way that they will interface with their containers. So while Docker is a very critical underlying layer, it's not necessarily the place that all customers are going to be thinking about from a security standpoint. They oftentimes will think about, this overall set of capabilities, not just how do you actually run the container, but how do you deploy them, how do you manage them, how do you operate them at scale over time. And that's really where the orchestrator piece of this comes into play as well.
Yeah, right. And I will say winning's relative, right? If you define winning as, yes, they're using the Docker container, which in many cases is free and open source, yes, they're winning hands down. But in terms of a revenue winner, ultimately, I think that remains to be seen, right? And that's why they race the horses. But that being said, from a security point of view, this is certainly a great way to organize 5 areas that you need to be paying attention to. Ronnie, what do you think?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that maybe I hope I'm not kind of anticipating your next slide, but there's also a CIS Kubernetes benchmark that is slightly newer, and and so they're quite in line with market progress on this, which also sets some checks and best practices for that you can check against to secure your environment. And I think these benchmarks are really important in terms of standardization and best practices. They don't necessarily help you do the job, right? So they help you know what you should be doing. But they're quite extensive. There's a lot of different checks, and so there is still a lot of education to do in the market to basically get the skill set up and teach people how to do this efficiently and help them to get there quickly. That's, I think, key to this whole evolving ecosystem that we see.
Excellent point. So first of all, I don't have the CIS Kubernetes benchmark up, but it's something everyone should look at as well as the Docker one. But you also brought up another point, and this is not even container specific, but it's generally we see in the tech space across the board, and that's the lag time from a benchmark like these coming out, from people like yourselves who are sort of cutting edge on container security versus where the skill set and knowledge base is in the marketplace, right? And oftentimes, I mean, we certainly saw it, Carson, if you remember, in cloud security, of I'm sure you do, right? Where we had an idea that using the cloud was going to make us as good or as secure as we were without the cloud, but in fact could make us even more secure than we were without the cloud. But it took It took 5 to 7 years or more for, number one, the perception on that to change, and number two, the skill sets and then tool sets to catch up to it. And I wouldn't be surprised if we're seeing the same thing around container security. What does my panel think?
Well, I think that's a very good way to look at it. I mean, it's a new technology space, and while containers are an evolution of a lot of technologies that have been around for a while, it's kind of the nature of IT, right? Cloud was just a different way of doing virtualization, which was a different way of doing LPARs and so forth over time. So none of this stuff is necessarily net new, but at the same time, the space that we have here with containers is not just like different in the sense that the technology itself is different, and thus there's different threats and risks, which is true. But I think almost uniquely in this case, you've got a technology pattern that actually enables you to do things from a security standpoint in ways that are much more automated and much more effective than what you've been able to do in the past. If you think about like the traditional world prior to containers, you were dealing with an environment in which most of the entities in that environment were kind of manually configured, uniquely configured, not really managed through any sort of automation. And that makes it really difficult to secure, because now you're securing hundreds or thousands of things that are all kind of their own unique variants, which it makes it very difficult to understand like what the baseline should be and to find anomalies for it. And so what we're trying to do with containers is to take advantage of the fact that containers are, they're minimalistic, so you don't have this huge virtual machine with all these OS files in it. Containers are also very declarative. So instead of having to guess what it's supposed to do, you can see in a Docker file and understand exactly how it's composed and what it's going to run. And then they're very predictable. So, at runtime, you understand that this container that's supposed to run Apache should only be running HTTPD. But more importantly, that enables you to learn that via software and create policies to enforce that, which is something that's historically been really hard, right? I mean, if you wanted to say like this web server should only run this application, you could do that with VMs, but you're doing that in a very manual process. Containers, because of those three attributes, enable you to do that through a more automation, which really enables you to do security in a much more scalable way.
Yep.
Yeah, and I would add on to that, Alan. You asked about the cloud security time frame that it took for people to sort of get their heads around it. I actually think that containers are going to go faster with that regard, because we're building on the back of cloud infrastructure security. I think that provided some learnings. The things that come to mind at once are the general concept of a gold master image, if you will. That's something that's very appealing to security practitioners, and for years and years, you could talk to anybody who's been in the industry more than 10 years, and they'll talk to you about the multiple failed projects to try to standardize configurations. Well, now we can do that because that's inherent, as previously mentioned, to the container model. I think that on top of that, there's been a lot of good research that shows that the cost of addressing security issues, if you deal with it by shifting left and dealing with security issues before they make it to a production environment, is much, much lower. So I actually, from our perspective anyway, we're seeing a lot of enterprises really lean into container technology and continuous delivery methods that go with them much more aggressively than we even saw cloud infrastructure adoption, I think, for those reasons.
Agreed.
Yeah,
Agreed.
I agree. We see the same thing. And we also, I think it's not just a cost issue, it's almost a necessity. Because of the way that containers are moving so fast and can scale up and out so quickly, you really have no choice but to really do things as early as possible in the life cycle. Because if you try to bolt on security as an afterthought, you're probably not going to be able to control the horses that are already out of the stable. So the approaches that only try to control container behavior in runtime I think are doomed to fail ultimately, because there's some really more basic stuff you have to do, and in terms of basic hygiene, things like vulnerabilities, things like configuration management, things like secrets and other things that you just don't want running unbridled in your environment. You want to reduce capabilities, reduce privileges well before you actually get into production, and then your attack surface is much smaller. You can actually control things and see things in a clearer way. If you don't do that, the sheer scale of it is daunting. And there's also another kind of macro aspect to this, which is around the security skill gap, right, or the inability to man all the security positions out there. And guess what? There are a lot more developers out there than there are security people. And if you empower the developers to do some of the security for you in a way that's automated and really embedded into their process, doesn't require them to do anything in particular, just builds it into their process, then you're leveraging your developer force a lot better and reducing the workload for security guys who have been, spending the past few years chasing after, attack vectors and new threats that develop at an alarming rate and much faster than they can kind of develop defenses against them. So I think, there is a macro story here, which, maybe containers are the answer to help solve it.
Fair enough. Yep. So guys, let me to keep us moving along, let me say that the basic three principles we went over in the previous slide, the CIS Docker benchmark, the CIS Kubernetes benchmark, these are general sort of guides that are available to everyone. They can download, they can educate themselves, reference to them in the ebook. I wanted to kind of leverage the three of you though and give them some pro tips and talk about some common myths and stuff like that that they're not going to get in the CIS guide maybe, and they could get some value and takeaways out of this. So let's go to this. Let's go to pro tips from our pros. I asked our panel to throw in some tips, and we've got a few here, and let's hit them. And I'm going to ask each one of you to comment if you'd like on them. And Ronnie, we'll start with you with the one on top here. Do basic hygiene first. If you don't, no amount of fancy next-gen network security will save you.
Yeah, this goes back to what I was saying. Yeah, it goes back to what I was saying before. I think, if many of you in the security space probably have heard the house analogy. So if you have a house and it has many windows and doors, and all of them are open and unlocked, the fact that you have a fancy house monitoring system is not necessarily going to prevent anyone from going in, stealing what they want, and leaving. So, kind of locking down the house, locking the windows, removing, all these openings is something that's quite basic to security. Preventive measures first, right? React, respond later. So I think that's one area where we see, and customers, by the way, generally I think agree with this concept. If you look at what companies are doing, it also aligns with their their adoption curve of container technology. They try to do these things first. It's really quite basic, and so you want to do these things in a way that is congruent with the development cycle of containers and the way that you deploy them. And I think John mentioned before, there's a lot of things you can do around, understanding what the capabilities that a container really needs in the context of the application are, and then only allow those. So it really is as simple as that.
Got it. Excellent. All right. Another pro tip. Minimize privileges and capabilities, especially never run as root. You would think that's common sense, but we know better. John Murillo, I know in your time in the world, you've run into this outside of containers even. But you want to comment on that one?
Sure. I think this kind of reinforces the point that I was making earlier. What Ronnie was just saying as well is that it's not one of those situations in which containers are like completely changing the way that you do security. All the best practices that we've told people for 20 years now about minimizing privilege and having good credentials and keeping stuff up to date, all that stuff is just as applicable with containers, and this is an example of one of those. There's no reason to run containers with higher privileges that are required. Now, one of the challenges that comes along with that, though, is especially as organizations are going through and trying to containerize existing applications. A lot of those existing applications just really were not created very securely in the first place, right? I mean, everybody has these legacy apps that, require running with administrative privileges or being able to, update binaries and user bin or whatever it might be. And so it's not really a container problem as much as it is a problem with the applications that you put inside the containers. I mean, containers actually give you a lot more control and a lot more capability to reduce the attack surface, to reduce the level of privileges that are required than you've really ever been able to feasibly do in prior technologies. The challenge that you have, though, is you still have to make sure that the applications that you run inside of those containers are really being configured and running properly, and are able to run in that least privileged manner. So I think one of the things that's important with that is to understand what are the apps that you're running there, to understand what are the policies and profiles that you can use with those applications, like with seccomp and so forth, to minimize the privileges they require. And then having a tool like what we make at Twistlock, or what Ronnie makes at Aqua, being able to utilize tools that not only give you visibility of what your containers are running and the configuration of them from a security standpoint, but also give you the ability to enforce that. So you can have a rule that says, in my production environment, don't allow containers to run as root, as an example. So you need to have not just the awareness of the app, but also a mechanism to monitor and to enforce that.
Excellent. Let's go to our next kind of pro tip here from the pros. Assume your containers will run everywhere. And by that, and it actually goes, Santiago had asked a question in our questions thing about where you run your containers and what does that mean for the security. But assume your containers will run everywhere. Yes, they run a lot in the cloud, no doubt about it. But containers can run on bare metal. They run in public cloud, public cloud, private cloud, hybrid cloud. Some run in VMs, some don't run in VMs. Heck, I'm seeing containers running on IBM Z system mainframes. So, assuming your containers will run everywhere and basing your security processes and engagement based upon that. So we've hit Ronnie. Carson, this one's, I guess, for you then. What advice, tips on that can we talk about?
Yeah, I think the key thing here is that as people on the call are looking for security solutions for container environments, portability is critical. I think that's the key takeaway here. You are going to have containers that run everywhere. One of the core use cases for containers, most people sort of get microservices and containers hung up together maybe more often than they should be. One of the other big use cases for containerization is to allow portability between cloud environments. So we see large enterprises that are, as an example, interested in using analytics with spot pricing for cloud infrastructure instances, and the containerization gives them the ability to move between those environments very, very easily. So the portability is going to be very, very crucial. By extension of that, the other component here is, if you take a step back and look at the larger picture, the DevOps picture, which Alan, I know is near and dear to your heart, the way that things are managed now are not as much component level. So instead of having a team that manages firewalls and a team that manages server security and a team that manages AppSec and another team that manages container security, with the DevOps model, that one single team is managing the entire stack from soup to nuts, the entire application. That means that portability across environments is also very important. So some of a single application may run in the data center on traditional servers. Some of that application might be containerized. Some of those containers could be in AWS. Some could be on-prem. So the way that applications generally, more broadly, are assembled today, especially in a DevOps-like environment, really sort of makes the ability to manage multiple types of components from portability perspective also very, very important.
Fair enough. I agree with you there. Let me stay on this one a second, and if it's okay, Ronnie, I'd like to come back to you on it. The fact that your containers are going to run on so many different platforms, infrastructure, right? What does that mean for security?
So yeah, it is, I think, one of the big changes that containers enable as well, because you're essentially, what you're trying to do is attach security to the application. So you're moving security with the application, as opposed to kind of resetting it or reconfiguring it wherever you're trying to run the application. And as I think all of us noted at some point in this conversation before, the ability to really build this into the containerized application early on makes it possible to do that. If you look at what the cloud is doing to security focus in general, a lot of the infrastructure, network, identity management stuff, it is being taken care of for you, right? So, if I'm running applications on Amazon, I don't need to worry about data center security. A lot of the network stuff is taken care of for me, using Amazon tools, etc. But the application layer, that responsibility lies squarely with the customer. And this is where the focus is shifting. And with containers, what you can do is really create this uniform policy and enforcement model where you have the same controls no matter where you're running. And we have customers who run applications on-prem, on Amazon, on Azure, interchangeably, right? They don't even, they can run the same application one day here, another day there, and give their development teams flexibility around that. So you're decoupling, where you're running the application with from what the application is and what the security policy is.
Yep, fair enough. All right, let's go to another pro tip here, and that is treat your development environment like a production environment. And again, you might have an exception here and there where you just try some crazy stuff in your dev or dev test environment. But for the most part, you know what? If it worked in dev test, hopefully it works in production. But if you wouldn't do it in production, you really want to think about not doing it in your test environment. Deb, if you can go back to that slide, I think we might have accidentally moved ahead. But while we're getting back to that slide, John, what about that advice of doing it in your dev and test environment, or don't do, right? If you won't do it in production, don't do it in dev test.
Yeah, I mean, and I would say actually the opposite as well. If you're not going to do it in dev test, don't do it in production either. Having better fidelity between the different stages of your deployment pipeline is important, not just from a security standpoint, but just from a application reliability standpoint as well. It makes it really hard to make sure that your app is going to work the way that you expect it will if the place that you tested is very dissimilar from the place that you actually operated. Excuse me. From a security standpoint, I think this is one of the other opportunities that containers bring from a security perspective, because historically it's been really difficult for most organizations to take your standard nasty, hairy line of business application that might require 3 or 4 different virtual machines and all these various configurations and so forth, and deploy that exactly the same way, even twice in a row in the same environment, much less to deploy it the same way in multiple environments. Because containers provide that capability, when you containerize that application, even if it's a complex application, you can know that when you do a Docker run or you do a kubectl create or something to deploy that app, you can know that it's going to look and behave the same way and run the same bits as it will from one environment to another. And that really enables you for the first time to have a security test process that begins early in the CI process that allows you to really validate the security configuration of that app throughout its life cycle before it ever gets to production. And again, I think that's one of the really cool things that containers enable from a security standpoint, is that fidelity between environments that if you're an organization you can take advantage of, can really leave some very powerful benefits.
I was on mute there. So we're back to pro tips here. John, thanks for explaining that.
Okay,
all right.
No problem.
I would like now to move to the next screen, the next slide, which is talking a little bit about some myths that we see in the container space. And frankly, some of them are pretty well ingrained at this point, which is amazing for a you know, this hasn't been out that long, and already we're starting to see these urban legends pop up. And then just remind people that if you do have questions about any of this, please do pop your questions into the questions section, because it'll make it a lot easier for us to get to them. So let's look at some of these myths that we see in here. The first one, and I think Ronnie actually suggested this one, but it's so, man, I run into this all the time. And that is containers equal microservices. So to me, guys, this is, something I learned in elementary school. I'll never forget, a teacher told us that all spaghetti is macaroni, but not all macaroni is spaghetti. Okay. And, yes, containers and microservices are sort of intrinsically linked, but there's a big microservices world out there outside of containers. And I would say you could, so the real question then is, can you have containers without microservices? And Ronnie, this was, I think, one of your suggestions, so I'm going to ask you that.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I think there's a big overlap between containers and microservices, in the sense that people use containers to develop and run microservices based applications. However, when people think of microservices, they tend to think of Netflix and Google and Facebook and applications like that are really based on hundreds, if not thousands, of microservices. And you don't really have to go crazy with that to enjoy the benefits of containers, right? So, if we go to the other extreme, don't take a legacy monolithic application and turn it into a single container image that is 4 gigabytes and expect to run that as a container efficiently. That's not going to happen. But at the same time, there's a whole continuum of things you can do here, which is breaking down or refactoring the application somewhat, and get the benefits of containers without going all the way to true microservice architecture. At the same time, like you said, there are microservices have been around for a while, and a lot of them run without containers. But no doubt, containers are a great packaging mechanism for microservices.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So the next myth I wanted to hit, and again, poor Santiago, we I guess we anticipated your question here. He had made a comment on what's the advantage of having containers on top of VMs. They're redundant. And that's another, I think, myth that we see out there, is that containers make VMs redundant and they will completely replace VMs. Not so at all. Is but what do I know? John, what do you think about that?
It's actually, I think, I'll blame you and your brethren in the media a little bit for that, Alan. I think I've read a lot of articles, and not as many these days, but like 2 or 3 years ago, I used to see so many articles that were like, "Are containers going to kill VMs?" and things of that nature. And the reality is, they're different tools that solve different problems. You very rarely, in fact, in my experience, almost never encounter customers that are dogmatic about it and say, we're not going to use any virtual machines. We're only going to run containers on bare metal or something of that nature. The virtualization does a really good job of allowing you to effectively, drive up utilization of your hardware. Containers allow you to really drive up utilization of your operating systems and to be able to have much better and cleaner abstraction of the application from the host OS. But the two really work, they work together. I mean, you're not going to probably be running containers on bare metal and want to be dealing with all the complexities of, Pixie booting operating systems every time you get a new server. You want to use virtualization and be able to use that to be able to zone things out and have things of dissimilar workloads potentially sharing the same physical hardware, because you've separated them onto different VMs. Whereas containers give you that ability to really more effectively deploy and operate and run your applications in ways that are more agile, and also just give you some other natural advantages from the perspective of a developer experience and be able to get those applications out more quickly. So there are definitely some similarities between virtualization and containers. I mean, they're both about taking something and packaging it up and making it portable, but they address different layers of the problem, and they're much more complementary than they are competitive.
Fair enough. Carson, want to double back on you on that because, look, Cloud Passage grew up in the cloud. What do you see with VMs and containers?
Yeah, I would actually go a slightly different route, and my belief is that 3 to 5 years out, it's not containers that make VMs redundant. I actually think that serverless computing will make at least for more modern applications both VMs and containers redundant. This stuff is not easy to operate. You need pretty specialized skill sets. It's new. There aren't a lot of people who know it. So again, we're seeing a lot of people sort of skip right over the container world and move right to serverless computing. As far as VMs go, I think that the way to think about this is containers could make VMs redundant. But the reality is when you're the CIO of a huge bank and you're looking back over your hundreds of thousands of virtual machines, what's the benefit? What's the cost benefit of going and ripping and replacing existing virtual machines with containers? I think the other component here that someone mentioned earlier, you don't just lift and shift an application to a containerized environment. You have to refactor it. And again, that represents a much larger investment. So while I think the potential is there, I think that in most cases, at least for large enterprises, the cost benefit to do that sort of painful rip and replace process, it's just not there. So even though it could be, I don't think it will be. But in terms of really having a significant impact on servers that are running in general, I think that serverless is really going to have the bigger impact over time.
Sure. So another one, and it kind of goes, it's the flip side of the VM, which is containers only run in the cloud. So they only run on VMs because we only see containers in the cloud. And we talked about that a little earlier. But again, if you don't mind, John, why don't we dispel that myth?
That one is more correct, I guess, more accurate than the last one. Certainly, I would say that the majority of the customers that we see run containers in a cloud. Let's say a cloud. Probably out of our whole customer base, maybe 75% of the customers are running in some sort of public cloud provider. However, that 25% that's not is we have a lot of customers in the Intel community and financial services and so forth, and those guys have their own private cloud for various regulatory and security reasons, both real and imagined. But in any case, they have their own private clouds that they operate on. Almost everybody that I see is using some sort of cloud, be it public or private, which kind of implies some kind of virtualized layer with kind of the infinite capacity, infinite storage mechanisms that you expect if you're running a public or private cloud, underpinning the place that they run containers. There have been a handful of times where I've talked to or attended a session at KubeCon or something with somebody at some startup talking about running containers on bare metal, and I'm sure it's out there, but it's certainly not a very common thing that we experience. Most of the time, we see customers running containers on a virtual machine, either in their own private cloud or in some public cloud provider.
Yep. I will. I do a lot of research. We talk to a lot of people. We are seeing containers on bare metal, and some, not, you want to call them private cloud or just old hosting provider, data center providers are really trying to make a living around that containers on bare metal type of environment. And again, recently I got a whole update on the new IBM, I think the latest generation Z system. And it's amazing how much container related, when you think about it, you've been able to run containers in Linux forever, right? But how much container-related functionality is built into these latest gen of mainframes? Let me touch on another. I'm going to take the next myth, and that is that you don't patch containers. After all, they're immutable. So, I did some of my own, and it might be subjective, not objective research at DockerCon over the last couple of years, and KubeCon, and that is in speaking to big companies, I say, hey, one of the great things about containers is you just, take down the old ones and roll out the new ones because, after all, it's immutable infrastructure. And the fact of the matter is I think most large organizations, the overwhelming majority of them, they don't work like that. It's much easier for them to patch than it is to just throw away the old and stand up the new with the flip of a switch. It just don't work like that. Ronnie, what do you think?
I would split this into two, right? So can you patch containers? You can. Should you? Probably not. So yeah, I think containers are not immutable, by force of nature. This is something that has to be enforced if you want it to work correctly. Um, but yeah, I mean, images, basically the container images, the static version that developers create from which the containers are run, those are the ones you want to change, right? Those are the ones you want to update and then refresh the containers based on that. And the reasoning is very simple, by the way, because you could be running, I don't know, a MongoDB image in your application, but that MongoDB image is instantiated into 5,000 containers running on different nodes. You're not going, let's say you found an issue now, you're not going to patch 5,000 containers. You're going to patch the one image, and then that image will be reinstantiated into the new version of these containers, replacing the old ones, and that can be done in seconds. So that's the beauty of the immutable approach.
Yep, almost hybrid patching. Guys, I know we started a little late, but we're coming up on top of the hour. I want to just quickly, Deb, if we can go to the next slide. I want to, first of all, thank all three of you, but I wanted to talk quickly about each of your companies for a moment or two, and if you don't mind, I'm going to do it. So, first of all, we've got Aqua Security, who Ronnie Osnett was kind enough to join us. There's a little bit of background from Aqua, and where they play and kind of their view of it, with some follow-up and contacts and where you can get some more information. So, all three of these companies, by the way, are great if you have a container security need. So this is a lot about Aqua. If we can go to the next one, Deborah, and that would be, well, I'm not seeing it, but it could be me. I happen to know, though, because I did the slides. The next one is our friends at Cloud Passage and Carson Sweet, and I'm assuming you guys are seeing the slides because my computer seems to be just crapped out today. But the what you can find about Cloud Passage, one of the nice things is Carson and I know each other a long time. Cloud Passage has been a pioneer in the cloud security space, and now in container security, that expertise is bleeding over, building on it, and trying to get that slide up there. But you'll be able to download the slides and see that. And then certainly last and not least is the Twistlock slide, and I'm not sure. Oh, okay, we got the Cloud Passage Halo slide going. Yeah, we skipped right by that. I apologize, but it's out there. And then we are at the top of the hour. But Twistlock, native container security. I remember the day they announced, and John and Ben and the team have done a great job over there as well. A little bit about Twistlock, guys. All three of these ads, or these companies, are in the ebook that everyone who attends or who registered for today, and there's 500 or 600 of you, will receive a copy of. You can reach out to all three of these companies. We're not in the business of recommending vendors, but all three of these are quality container security providers that I personally have known for a number of years and highly recommend. With that being said, let me go to the last slide. If you can't wait to get the ebook mailed to you, here is the download link, and you can go and download the container security book right now. Luckily, I was able to incorporate a lot of the questions from the audience into our discussion, so we did a good job of anticipation. Let me thank Ronnie, Carson, John. Thanks so much, guys, for joining us today. I hope our audience got a lot out of it. And as I said, this is being recorded. You'll be able to listen to it over again. download the ebook. Check out Aqua or Twistlock or Cloud Passage or all three if you have any questions around container security. This is Alan Schimmel for DevOps.com, Security Boulevard, Container Journal. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon.